All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we have taken a little bit of a detour to go into a series of Bible decodes. I believe this is number 137, and we've been looking at the New Testament, and we've been looking at the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. The New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars, and in particular the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, that is Emperors Vespasian and his two sons Titus and Domitian, from 69 to 96 AD, 69 to 96 AD. And they basically, there was a number of different strategies, a number of different theories around this. There's many works that are either related to or right on this topic, including several in this century. Joseph Atwill and Henry Davis, and now this work from Michael Menescatz, the work from Roman Piso, and late last century, going into this century, Abelard Reuchlin. But it goes back much further to the folks at Oxford in the early 20th century, James Valentine Hannay and Sir Ronald Syme, and also University of Berlin's Bruno Bauer in the 19th century, and many popular authors from the 17th century on have written about this, including, according to Joseph Atwill, the entire works of William Shakespeare are about how the Romans wrote the New Testament. And he demonstrates this. Also, John Hudson writes about this, as well as Menescatz. We're looking at the work of Michael Menescatz here. His book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. So the Flavians wrote the New Testament in the 70s AD. It might have started much earlier than that, but they at least pulled the trigger on releasing it in the 70s AD, and they backdated the events of Jesus's life by 40 years. And so they put Jesus's ministry in Judea to occur from 30 to 33 AD. At the very same time, they wrote a history of the Jewish War. That was a war between the Romans and the Jews that occurred in Judea from 66 to 73 AD. Now, the two Flavian emperors, the two first Flavian emperors, Vespasian and Titus, were generals in that war. Titus was the general from 66 to 69 AD or so. Maybe 70 AD, 69. And at a certain point, he became the new emperor. And he appointed his son Titus to be the new general. And so Titus they both basically had a 3.5-year military campaign in Judea. But in particular, scholars have looked at the military campaign of Titus. So this is all summed up in a book by an author named Josephus, and it's called Jewish War, or War of the Jews. Now, Christians generally use this book, this work, and this author, Josephus, as a corroborating witness to Jesus, because Josephus mentions and really mentions is correct, is pretty much offhanded comments about the existence of Jesus in his later work that's called Antiquities of the Jews. And he refers to it a little bit in Jewish War, not so overtly. But what the Christians don't tell you is that Josephus, his first name or his title or his new name is Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a member of the Roman royal family by adoption. According to his autobiography, he was one of the Jewish generals in this war against the Romans. But he was less than enthusiastic, and at a certain point he surrendered to Vespasian. And when he did so, he felt as if God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. So he defected to the Romans. He told Vespasian, "One day I predict that you will become emperor." And when Vespasian did become emperor, he pardoned Josephus and he brought him to Rome with him, gave him a townhouse at Caesar's palace, made him the court historian, and adopted him into his family. So he's now Flavius Josephus. So the story, the history, and now you may also know that Josephus is acclaimed by scholars as one of the great historians ever. And this work, The Jewish War, is possibly the most eminent historical piece that's ever been written, certainly in antiquity. And you can say that until you actually open it up. And what you're going to find is you're going to find the history of Titus's 3-year military campaign in Judea from 70 to 73 AD, possibly starting at the end of 69 AD. His campaign didn't start till 70. And it tells you all the places that Titus goes and the various battles that he fights and the various other adventures or circumstances that he finds himself in. And if you read the New Testament, you will find that Jesus, in his 3-year ministry in Judea, goes to the exact same places that Titus goes, in the same order. And wherever he goes, he encounters a parallel event to that of Titus. It's not the same event, but it's conceptually the same. It's the same type of event. There are many different parallels between the events. There's also a theme that's involved where many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament and where Jesus makes these prophecies in a very symbolic manner. The prophecies are fulfilled literally by Titus 40 years later, sometimes to the very hour, in War of the Jews. So basically, the story of Jesus is the story of Titus, and it's just grafted onto this structure that occurred 40 years, that they backdated by 40 years. That is according to the history of Josephus. And the fact that Titus fulfills the prophecies of Jesus, also, if you're willing to ignore the parallels, the fact that Titus fulfills those prophecies makes him the second coming of Jesus. And so that you shouldn't be looking for the second coming of Jesus now out of the book of Revelation occurring in the 20th century. It occurred in the 1st century, 40 years after Jesus, his ministry. And he says that at a certain point as well, that it is going to happen within the lifetime of people who are living. But anyway, there are many, many, many other themes and parallels between the two, such that it becomes a theory and a thesis for several authors that whoever Josephus was, he was writing from Caesar's palace at Rome, where he lived for the rest of his life, according to his autobiography. And whoever Josephus was, he also wrote the New Testament. They were written by the same person and at the same time for the same reason. They both parallel each other. They parody each other. So it's not a one-way thing. It's a mutual bouncing back and forth kind of thing. And Michael Menescot's in this book looks for parallels to the book of Luke, the third gospel and War of the Jews. He found 250 parallels in just the book of Luke. That's over 10 per chapter. And, they run the gamut. Some of them are incredibly weak, and some of them are incredibly strong. But what he also did is he charted them. He put them on a graph. Put the book of Luke on the vertical axis, and he put War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every time he found a correspondence or a parallel, he put a dot there. And then when he was done with that, he looked and saw that he had made 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman royalty, APTVS. The AP is curious, but the TVS would definitely be standing for Titus Vespasianus. And that was an imprint that was used on coins from the period. So it's not a big stretch. The odds of something like that happening are, I would say, negligible. And to me, it basically means that not only did the Romans write, in this case, the book of Luke, but really all of the Gospels. And not only did they write the book of Luke, but they literally signed their name to it. But you have to break down the code before you can see that. And anybody who doesn't break the code fails the test and is, as a result, worships a false god forever and ever. I don't think they wanted it to last for 2,000 years. They wanted it to be discovered at a certain point after they died. I don't think they would have thought that it would have lasted for 2,000 years before anybody figured this out. But it didn't. A lot of people figured it out a long time ago. The Jews who wrote the Talmud, they hinted about it and they knew about it. The motives are clear for the Romans. They were sick of the Jews. The Jews were a thorn in their side ever since the Romans took over in Judea about 63 BC. So for over 100 years, it was one revolution after an uprising, after a war, after an insurrection. The Jews were the chosen people, and they believed in a monotheistic God, and so they were very xenophobic. They didn't want to mix with other people, and the Romans wanted to absorb them into their empire. The Jews also had a jealous and zealous God who wanted them to perform a bunch of quirky and idiosyncratic rituals, circumcision, kosher food laws, strictures against graven images, and animal sacrifices, Passover lambs, and so on. And the Jews were willing to die to maintain these rituals. The Romans were fine with the Jews' religion. They were like, go ahead, as long as you, worship our religion too. That's what the Roman policy was about all these other nations that were under their umbrella. You can, we're trying to absorb your religion, so you can celebrate your religion, but you need to have a statue of Caesar in your holy, confines. And the Jews were willing to die for that, and so they didn't go along with it. The Jews were also waiting for a Messiah. They were preparing for a Messiah who was going to come and, as a military leader, help them overthrow the Romans. And several messiahs came to the fore in the 60s AD and led a revolt of the Jews. That's Eleazar, Simon, and John, according to Josephus. And they kicked out the Herod puppets of Rome that ruled Judea at Jerusalem. And that's when Nero, the emperor, sent for General Vespasian. So Vespasian and Titus were both wounded in their military service in Judea, and they were just tired of these Jews. And so, they saw that there were probably more military messiahs on the way. And so they wrote a story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, and turning the other cheek to oppression, and believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and exhorting his creator or his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do, while at the same time going outside of the temple and overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers and disrupting the business of the Jewish vendors of pigeons and doves for the animal sacrifices. So this was a direct hit against the Jewish rituals, because the money changers were changing the Roman money that had graven images on it to the Jewish money so they could bring it into the temple for the offering. So the Jesus is a psychological operation that the Romans used in order to mellow out the Jews, or domesticate the Jews, tame the Jews, prune the Jews. These are all verbs that they use in their language. And the Romans, this was right down the central wheelhouse of the Romans. They created a number of religions for psychological purposes in the first century. And they had a monopoly on publishing. They had a monopoly on, really on Greek, which is the language of the New Testament. They had a, I'd say, near monopoly on Greek. There were some Jews of the elite Jews who spoke and wrote in Greek. They had a monopoly on censorship, and they had a monopoly on distribution. So we're going to take over here with reading from Menescott's book here. He's kind of going through a little bit of a statistical analysis showing that it would be impossible for there to be 250 plus parallels in the book of Luke that fit this APTVS pattern perfectly. The book of Luke only has 1,150 verses, and that's like one parallel per 4.6 verses, and many of the parallels go on for many, many verses. So there's just not even enough space in the book of Luke to accommodate all of these parallels if they were just kind of random or coincidental. So he says, even with these very conservative estimates, that means Luke would need to contain 4,000 verses that are involved in notable parallels seeming to parody Jewish war, all by coincidence. And that's physically impossible because Luke only has 1,150 verses. This is a huge result, so I will restate it. Only if Luke were nearly 4 times longer than it is, and only if almost every single verse contributed to a unintentional and coincidental yet notable parallel within Jewish war, would there be enough of these parallels for me to select from them in a biased fashion in order to create the exceptionally well-defined and detailed APTVS pattern? You can see the pattern in the thumbnail for the video. That's the overall pattern. The blue dots are where Luke is parodying Jewish war, and the black dots are where Jewish war is parodying Luke. Since Luke isn't large enough to contain so much text, this isn't merely implausible, but physically impossible. If my first analysis was not sufficiently convincing, this one completely rules out the biased selection scenario. Okay, flipping over to the next page. Hopefully we'll get to go over a few of the parallels, but this is more of a kind of a statistical analysis. The parallels have been presented. He presents all 250 of them in this book, and we've gone over most of them by now. Let's see. Okay, but is there a counter argument here? The fact that stories have sections with varying lengths and topics surely makes lines more likely to appear by chance. I also add that you can check this out for yourself. You don't have to believe him or me. You can get a copy of Josephus for free online and read it for yourself and compare it to the book of Luke in particular, but the Gospels in general. And even other parts of the New Testament, some of the epistles, and even Revelation is alluded to. But it's mainly the Gospels for Josephus. There's another author named Suetonius that covers a lot of the. He's another Roman royal. And he covers most of like Revelation, and Pliny the Younger is all over the epistles. Another Roman royal. As mentioned earlier, it was a simplification to assume that unintentional parallels would be distributed randomly, noting that some paragraphs and verses of the stories are longer than others. Although in the regions discussed, there is nothing unusual in the lengths of the paragraphs or chapters that I focused on, it is obviously true that different chapters, verses, and paragraphs do have different lengths and often cover different topics, some of which are more likely to result in parallels than others. I do accept that this would have the effect of making a vertical or horizontal line more likely to appear by chance. However, by the same logic, this has the effect of making a diagonal line less likely to occur by chance. Therefore, this makes the preceding calculations and arguments more robust, not less. Okay, this is his summary of this chapter. I have shown mathematically that if I was guilty of faking the APTVS signature unintentionally, intentionally or otherwise, by selectively choosing from a body of unintentional and thus randomly distributed parallels, this could only be done if there were a vast number for me to pick from, and simulations show that this would need to include at least 2,000 notable but unintended parallels where Jewish war mirrors Luke, but where Luke doesn't seem to parody Jewish war, enough to fill at least 4,000 verses of Luke and 5,000 sentences of Jewish war. Apparently, Jewish war is about 4,500 sentences. And rather more than 2,000 notable but unintended parallels where Luke has the semblance of parodying Jewish war, also involving enough text to fill at least 4,000 verses of Luke and 5,000 sentences of Jewish war. And again, Luke has only 1,150 verses. The absurdity of this scenario is already made clear by it requiring a series of coincidences in which essentially every sentence in Jewish war contributes to two notable parallels with different parts of Luke. But the absurdity of the scenario is even more stark when we consider that the series of coincidental yet not noteworthy parallels would have to be so extensive as to fill 4,000 verses of Luke, yet Luke has less than 1,200 verses. We are therefore left with the only alternative that a much smaller number of notable parallels exist, and the pattern we find them to be arranged in, forming the APTVS pattern, is simply the arrangement they are in fact arranged in. So my research isn't a case of finding a pattern in noise. Rather, the identified pattern is genuine, consisting of discrete lines forming a series of evenly spaced and sized Latin letters. Okay, let's see. I think we'll be starting a new chapter here on the next page. Please hold for processing. Thank you. Okay, Okay, this is chapter 16. Could the APTVS pattern be the result of coincidences? In the previous chapter, I showed that the APTVS pattern physically cannot be the result of a biased selection of parallels taken from a larger body of parallels. Here I will address whether the APTVS pattern could be the result of coincidences, which is a quite different question. What's the odds that so many noteworthy parallels will be arranged to spell out a well-defined and meaningful pattern? The bulk of my research was a survey of the parallels between Jewish war and the Christian Gospels, especially Luke. I found at least 300 parallels which seemed notable in how they stood out, and the locations of all of these parallels conforms to a clearly defined pattern when their locations were plotted. This pattern presenting the Latin letters A, P, T, V, and S. I'm sure I haven't found them all, and there could well be 400. There is also a group of parallels lying, so that would be a good test if somebody wants to look for more parallels to see if they'd fit within the APTVS pattern that's already been drawn out. Now, another good test would be to look at another one of the synoptic gospels, or possibly the Gospel of John, and see if there are parallels and if they could be mapped out as well. Now, it took Menescot's like 4 years to find this many parallels. There's a lot of background information. Like in many cases, he had to draw on information that isn't, at the tip of our tongues, although it maybe would have been well known to the Romans at the time. And it's very important to note that these parallels and these parodies are in general mean-spirited, mocking, ridiculing, and offensive to the Jews and now to the Christians. Anybody who believes in this is going to find that they're being ridiculed and mocked once they recognize the code that is therein. Much of it is pornographic. A lot of it is cannibalistic. There's a good dose of homosexual pedophilia mixed in with it. The Romans, they might have put some Roman Stoicism and some Greek Platonism and some ancient Egyptian stuff in there for all of the lofty literature. You got to understand it's a limited hangout. They have to put some good stuff in there too, that you can, you know, kind of believe in. But the other parts are strictly mean-spirited mocking, and so it's a limited hangout. They have to get you to believe in some of it, or else you're going to reject it outright. It's just like any other psychological operation that occurs here in the 20th century that the CIA has done or whatever, you know. It's exactly the same thing. Okay, there is also a group of parallels lying between the T and the V that don't align with this pattern, but later I will detail how the author left a hint instructing believers to rearrange that group up to the top, thereby ensuring they do align. It sounds kind of like a little bit of a fudge factor there, but however, we'll see how he explains it. However, in the interest of erring on the conservative side, let's assume that there are only 250 parallels that align with the APTVS pattern rather than over 300. It is difficult to say exactly how many other genuinely noteworthy parallels can be found that don't conform to the APTVS pattern, but I would suggest it is under 50. But perhaps there are others I have not found. So again, in the interests of erring on the conservative side, let's suppose there could be as many as 100. So what are the odds that a coincidental, randomly positioned parallel would align with the APTVS pattern? I will show later that the area of the chart that the APTVS pattern fills is slightly under 25%. So the odds of an unintentional parallel aligning with the APTVS pattern is at most 1 in 4. Armed with these conservative numbers, we can readily assess the probability that in the event of such noteworthy parallels, had occurred by chance, that they would then be arranged in this fashion. The odds are equal to achieving a 1 in 4 probability win on at least 250 out of 400 tries. I'd say that's pretty conservative and that's pretty accurate. I would agree with that. I'm a math guy, and you know, I think that's pretty much the way that he would fairly map this out. In theory, this is easily calculated if you use an online probability calculator that can cope with such extremely low probabilities. The probability of at least 250 successes out of 400 tries, when each has a 1 in 4 odds, are less than 1 in 10 to the 56th power.